Okay, so now that we know how to factor using a GCF, another part of our factoring flowchart was to factor by grouping. Recall from that flowchart, this is when I had 4 or more terms. So this is basically the technique we want to use if we have that. So if you look at my 4 examples, right, each one of them have at least 4 terms. So classic grouping technique. So what we're going to do, as the name suggests, is we're going to group up things to help us factor. And you'll notice if you try a GCF, right, there's, X is pretty close, but it's not common to all of them. Over here, 3 is common to some, but not all of them. 2 is common to 3 of them, but not all of them. So, there's not one overall GCF. But is there a way where I can group it where that GCF comes into play? Of course, when we're grouping things, that means I am using some parentheses, a grouping symbol, to put a couple of items together. And that's basically your associative property. So when I have a sum, we can break up a sum any way that I want. I can group it any way that I want. All right. And what I'd like to do first off, though, is take out my red pen and show you guys a classic mistake that I see from students when they want to introduce grouping symbols. Hopefully you guys noticed the mistake, right? Because we went from something that's being added together to something that's now being multiplied together. So we've lost that addition right there. So be careful when you are grouping. You have to group in such a way that you don't lose the fact that we're adding. So here's the correct grouping. I'm going to group the first 2 terms together, and then I'm going to add that to the grouping of the next 2 terms together. So this expression here is still equivalent to the one that I left if you just think in terms of when we're adding polynomials. We just basically drop the parentheses and combine like terms which there aren't any. So what I have here is the correct way to group. Yes, I will take points away if you group this way. You're not doing it right. Your math is wrong. Okay, so make sure you don't lose the fact that we're adding. Now that I have grouping, we're back to the GCF question. Right? What's the common factor amongst these 2 terms? Well, they both have an x squared in them. So I'm going to factor that x squared out, and what gets left behind is x plus 4. Right? X squared times x is x cubed. X squared times 4 is 4x squared. Plus, what's the GCF in these 2? Well, it's 3. So I'm going to take that GCF out, and what's left behind is x plus 4. Again, redistribute it, and I get the same thing. We're almost done because there's the addition symbol, and on each side of that addition symbol, I now see that I have a common factor of x plus 4. So I factor that out. What gets left behind is x squared plus 3. And there's your product. So this binomial times this binomial, right? These are the 2 things I have to multiply to create that 4-term polynomial. We factored by grouping. All right? So again, in rehash, be careful. We're going to be introducing grouping symbols, but be careful when you introduce them. Don't lose the fact that we're adding, and later on even we're subtracting. So the next one. All right, so again, we look for an overall GCF. There isn't one, but if I combine a couple of terms, we notice they do share some things in common. So to properly group that, right, I group the first 2 terms, I add that to the grouping of the second 2 terms. Asking my GCF question, right, what's the GCF between these 2? Well, 2's in common and x squared's in common. So I'll factor that 2x squared out. What gets left behind is x plus 3. Again, do a really quick redistribution to see that we're on the right track. Plus, what's the GCF between these 2 guys? Well, it's 5. Factor it out. What gets left behind is x plus 3. There's my plus sign, and on either side of that plus sign, I see now that the GCF is the x plus 3. So I factor that out. What gets left behind is 2x squared plus 5, and there's your product. We factored by grouping. We broke it up into a product. So this binomial times this binomial creates that 4-term binomial. What's challenging is when there's a subtraction. Now remember back in chapter 4, when we subtracted polynomials, we had to change the sign behind it. And then just when we were talking about a GCF, when I factored out a negative, I had to change the signs behind it. So be careful of that. So in the next one, again, I have 4 terms. There's not a GCF amongst all 4 of them, but I can group it up. I am grouping around a minus sign. So be careful. I'm going to group the first 2 together. There's my minus sign, and I have to change the signs behind it. It's like I factored out the minus. So what I get is 4x plus 8. Again, if you redistributed the minus, right, there's your negative 4x minus 8. So this equation, this expression and this expression are equivalent. All right, I factored around a minus and didn't lose the equivalency to what it's equal to. Again, that's good balance, that's good math. Looking at my GCF now, right, what's the common factor amongst these two? It's x squared. What gets left behind is x plus 2. Oops, I think I have an extra. Minus, what's the GCF between these two is 4. And what gets left behind is x plus 2. Sorry about that extra thing there. There's my minus sign. And so when I look at each side of the minus, right, what's now common is x plus 2. And what's left behind is x squared minus 4. All right, I'm going to asterisk this one. There's actually more we can do here, but since I am focusing on factoring by grouping, I'm just going to leave it as it is, right? So we're grouping around a minus. Be careful when you place your parentheses around. You have to change the signs, right? I'm factoring out a negative from these, so I change the signs behind it, and that pretty much keeps me constant. So last but not least, again, I have a 4-term polynomial. I'm trying to find the GCF of all of them. There isn't one, but there's 4 terms. So we're going to group the first 2 terms. We're grouping around a minus sign, so that means inside these parentheses, signs change. So this becomes a positive 6x, and that becomes a minus 4. Again, if you redistribute the minus, right, that times that is minus, that times that's plus. So I'm consistent. My 2 expressions are actually equivalent. What's my GCF? Well, on the front end here, right, it looks like it's just x squared. And what's left is 3x minus 2. On the back end here, what's common is a 2. And what's left is 3x minus 2. There's my minus sign. To the left and to the right of it, I can see the common factor of 3x minus 2. What's left behind is x squared minus 2. All right, and so there's your introduction to grouping. We're going to see a lot more of that in the next chapter. For those of you who are going to like the AC method that's coming up, this is all you're going to be doing on steroids. You're going to be grouping like crazy. But there's your introduction. And going back, let me come back to our flow chart from a while. Right, we now know, right, in terms of this flow chart, we know what it means to factor by using a GCF, and we know what it means to factor when I have 4 terms. All right, and so we now need to revisit these next 2 items, right? What are my patterns, and what in the world is the AC method in guessing and checking? So we're starting to fill in our little flow chart. More to come later. See you guys in the next video.